So time for the press preview then, checking out Monday's front pages for you. And tonight we'll see what is making the headlines with the journalist and author Yasmin Alibhai-Brown and the political editor at the Scottish Sun, Rachel Watson. Great to see you this Sunday evening. We'll chat in a moment. We'll check out those front pages for you first, though. Let's start with the Metro. It's leading on President Zelensky's defiant Victory Day message in which he likened President Putin to Hitler. Well, similar comments are on the front of the Telegraph, but this time from the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, who is set to accuse Mr Putin of mirroring the fascism and tyranny of 70 years ago. Fresh US sanctions on the bosses of Russia's Gazprom Bank is on the front of the FT. Meanwhile, The Guardian goes on the cost of living crisis, reporting a survey has found more than 2 million Britons have missed meals in the last month as they can't afford it. Many families are facing another energy price shock as prices doubled for 1 in 4 households. That's on the front of the Mirror. In a bid to help boost the economy, Boris Johnson is set to remove hundreds of EU laws, according to The Times. Meanwhile, the Mail claims a rattled Sir Keir Starmer has pulled out of a major speech as he faces pressure over a police investigation into alleged lockdown breaking. The Sun pays tribute to Minder and Sweeney tough guy Dennis Waterman, who sadly died at the age of 74. And let's finish on some good news. The Star says it's time to slap on the sun cream as Britain faces its hottest summer ever. Don't forget, by scanning the QR code you can see on screen during the programme, you can check out those front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch and listen to us. And, as I say, I'm joined tonight by Yasmin Alibhai-Brown and Rachel Watson. So, let's get cracking. We'll start with Ukraine, I think. Rachel, the front of the Metro, victory will be ours again. Tomorrow, Victory Day in Russia. And we're all waiting to see what President Putin has to say, because in many ways he's between a rock and a hard place, isn't he, as to whether he claims victory or says it's full-on war.
Yeah, and as you say, there's been a lot of waiting and anticipating just what will happen tomorrow and what Vladimir Putin will say. And I think today specifically, but over the weekend, we've seen those Western countries, allies of Ukraine, NATO members, try to get ahead of that. So we've seen additional visits to Ukraine, for example, over the last 24 hours. There's stories on most of the front pages around additional sanctions, for example, and this front page in the Metro, which focuses on that video that President Zelensky put out today on, what he sees as coming down the road for Ukraine. And I think this is something that President Zelensky has been very good at throughout the conflict in the country. I think he's a very good communicator, and he's made a number of these videos to try and get in front of it. This is a war like we've spoken about before, like no other. It's been fought obviously in Ukraine, but there is this whole communication side to it as well that President Zelensky has really harnessed. And I think I watched that video of him earlier, and it's very emotional, it's very touching, it's very, the fact that he is so defiant still. And I think that is, we've all kind of grown to know so much about this man that people knew very little of before. And I think it is because he is so good at getting that message across. And, as I said, I think there has been this huge effort to try and get in front of Vladimir Putin and what he might say. There's an expectation that he might refer to this as a war for the first time. We know in Russia he's spoken about it as a special operation previously. And that is something that experts have said over the last few days. They expect him to start referring to it as a war and to really ramp up the fact that he will continue to fight this.
Yeah, it was a very powerful message, wasn't it? He really has mastered the communications during this conflict. Yasmin, in front of the Daily Telegraph, Putin is mirroring Nazis, says the Defence Secretary. He's going to make this speech as well tomorrow. And, of course, Victory Day is meant to be about the Soviets celebrating victory over the Nazis. But Putin has claimed all along that this conflict is about getting rid of the Nazis from Ukraine, which is ridiculous.
It is ridiculous to us. But, countless Russians and their state-controlled media absolutely believe that. And it's so easy to produce images and conversations, as we know, to persuade a population which has very little access to alternative realities, if you like. But it's very important and interesting to look at this Nazi comparison, because one of the things the West should have acknowledged a long time ago is that Russia was with the Allies when the Nazis were defeated. And real sacrifices were made by Russians then. And to see that country under Putin today, how history has completely turned around. But I always get very uneasy when the word Nazi is used kind of carelessly. This is a particularly vicious war by a man who will not be stopped. And he just wants that old Soviet empire back.
Yeah,
and he's not going to stop.
Yeah, he does have a very warped sense of history, doesn't he? FT, Rachel, talking about fresh sanctions. The sanctions keep on coming. Are they making a big enough impact? Do you think Yasmin talking about the propaganda working in Russia, the people are suffering there economically?
Yeah, and I think that is one of the areas that if you read the story in the FT, so they open the story talking about the US targeting 27 financial executives in Russia with fresh sanctions. But we go further into the story and we look at other countries. For example, they talk about the G7 group and how they will look to try and put more financial pressure on Russia and those that it deems to be involved with Putin's regime or close to him. So really, really hardening the stance on sanctions, which they've continued to try and do. We've seen this done in groups and almost blocks, extra people, sanctions on extra people, for example, hardening those sanctions on people that they're already on. And then we hear that the EU again are going to look again at the sanctions that they have imposed because they obviously do them as a bloc. So I think the fact that they will negotiate for their sanctions, and it is that lever that they hope will just continue to push pressure on the people in Russia. And you see it, it's not just sanctions like this, but it's businesses that have pulled out of the country. So it feels like a very long time ago when it was on the news and we heard of all these companies and shops and restaurants that were shutting in Russia and they were going to close down their business there. Streaming websites, for example, and it's all about creating that pressure. But the question is, do the people of Russia, do they see that as the West being too strict? Do they believe the propaganda that Putin puts on them? And we know that not all Russians do. We know, we've seen the protests on the street. I was watching Sky's coverage earlier, speaking to people in Russia who don't want this war. They're already referring to it as a war. They don't want it. They can't believe what's happening. And I think that's what people hope that these sanctions will do, and continuing to harden the stance on that is one way of trying to force this war backwards. Yeah,
all very good points. Let's move on from Ukraine to Yasmin. We haven't spoken about Brexit for a while, have we? And it's back in the news following the announcement last night that Sinn Féin is now the largest party in the Northern Ireland Assembly. Let's look at this story in the Metro. Brexit row back on as Sinn Féin calls for a united Ireland. And Dominic Raab doing the rounds this morning, threatening to rip up the Brexit deal, warning that it could put stability in Northern Ireland in peril. What's going to happen here, do you think? It's the Queen's speech, of course, coming up.
I cannot believe that we've got a government in this country which is prepared to rip up its own agreement, its own long-fought agreement, which kind of saw off one prime minister. Now they're threatening to rip it up. What did it ever mean to them? I mean, the situation in Northern Ireland is very delicate. It's an important historical moment, but there seems to be, as we, if you read the front page of the FT, Financial Times, a kind of denial of what has just happened. nobody expected Sinn Féin to do as well as they did, and they're underplaying it and sometimes kind of rewriting history almost. We've got Sinn Féin haven't gained street. Brandon Lewis, Northern Ireland secretary, says or will say tomorrow. I'm sorry, this is real. It happened. What has been amazing about the Good Friday Agreement is the fact that they all do have to work together. I wish we had that system, incidentally, that after an election, you just do have to get on. If they're going to put that at risk and rip up their own agreement, Lord knows what happens to Brexit next.
But of course, the DUP refusing to form a new assembly until changes are made, Rachel. So it is a bit of a stalemate.
Yeah, it is, and it feels, Yasmin says they do have to work together. They do for this to move forward, but we find ourselves in a bit of a paralysis with this. If the DUP won't agree to work with Sinn Féin as things stand, nobody can move forward at the moment, and I think that is a huge issue here. We're obviously talking about the Northern Ireland Protocol and Brexit, but there's also the talk around a potential border poll, and Sinn Féin leaders talking about a border poll could happen within the next 5 years. So there's that side of it as well that I think is really important. And, the comments from Brandon Lewis, he's absolutely trying to play down the fact that Sinn Féin, being the largest party, could lead to this. His comments massively trying to underplay what's happening. But I think when you look back at polls as well, it was really interesting. I went back and looked at some polls in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland over the past couple of months, show that in Northern Ireland there is a majority, I think it was 54% in the poll that I saw carried out recently, that Northern Ireland staying in the UK. But when you look at the Republic of Ireland, a majority supported a united Ireland, but there was less support when people felt that it would impact their taxes or spending, or the impact that could have on flag or national anthem, for example. So there's so much of this. It's such a huge story that's just come, it's really growing over the weekend. And as Yasmin said, nobody expected Sinn Féin to do as well. So we are now having discussions on a lot of things that people maybe didn't think we'd be having at this point in time.
Yeah, and as you say, so it's come in, Yasmin.
Sorry. I just want to celebrate Michelle O'Neill, the female leader. I mean, it is quite a moment to have her as a leader, whatever one thinks of the political parties. And has a real gift for communication. So, as a woman, I honour her, really. OK, well, let's talk about a different leader, Keir Starmer, who, the hangover from Beergate continues, doesn't it? Daily Mail, Yasmin, it's been on their front page for the last few days now. Rattles Starmer snubs the chance to clear the air. There was this leaked memo yesterday. What do you make of this story, Yasmin? Well, it's not going to go away now until the police investigation concludes and, we find out whether the rules were broken. And if rules were broken, then both he and Angela Rayner will have to decide what to do. But I think that's right and fair. But what isn't fair is if this is used to create an impression, which is that all politicians are as bad as one another. Because what happened in Downing Street is quite another matter. And I do hope the Sue Gray report is soon published. I'm not going to defend Keir Starmer until I know what really happened, what the police say. But you can't make an equivalence between, parties which had karaoke and suitcases of drink being brought in. And what we really need is for all these reports now to be done and for us to find out what an independent investigation is telling us. Rachel, a quick thought on this. I mean, I guess the problem is that, as always, if you're upfront at the beginning about exactly what went on, then things get a lot easier further down the line. Yeah, and it's a problem that all political parties seem to have. If you look back over the last few months, when you just hold your hands up and say, this is what happened,
I'm sorry, and provide the details when you're asked about it, people move on pretty quickly. But we saw it with the UK government, with Owen Paterson, with Partygate. Now we see it with the Labour Party, that refusal just to put your hands up and provide the details that you've been asking for just prolongs it. It makes it even worse. And I think, I've not had been able to look inside the Mail at this story, but the fact that Starmer appears to have cancelled a speech at an event that he could take journalist questions at tomorrow, it just is another bad look, isn't it? And I think that is, it's all about the perception here as well.
OK, and just 20 seconds, Yasmin, front page of The Guardian. The new Doctor Who has been announced formally. He was at the BAFTAs, Ncuti Gatwa. Are you pleased about this?
Very, very, very pleased. Scots from Rwanda, gay, wonderful, what's not to like?
And what about, Rachel, the fact that he forgot to wear a shirt at the BAFTAs?
I did see that outfit choice earlier. It was you get creative with these, don't you? They all get very creative.
He needs to get in his time machine and go back and fix that, I think. Thank you both very much. We'll speak again in half an hour.